Number 9. A barred romance. In 2020, while working as a guard at Berrin Prison in Wrexham County, Wales, Jennifer Gavin started an inappropriate relationship with a 23-year-old inmate named Alexander Coxon. Word eventually reached her bosses, who caught her secret lover trying to give a cell phone to another prisoner. On the phone, authorities found explicit photos of a woman who they suspected but couldn't confirm at the time was Gavin. They also discovered videos of the woman lip-syncing to multiple songs, which she initially denied sending to the smuggled phone. Gavin eventually admitted that it was her in the nude photographs, but she denied receiving payments in exchange for bringing the phone into the facility. An investigation revealed that Coxon's sister transferred payments to Gavin's personal bank account, which she would have had no other legitimate reason for doing. Besides sending the photos, the disgraced corrections officer admitted to having a relationship with Coxon. She said it all started when she kissed him in the prison's kitchen during his cleaning duty. Naturally, Gavin's conduct got her in trouble with her job and the law itself. Her defense attorney claimed she was simply an empathetic, immature, and naive person who struggled with low self-esteem. They said she felt especially bad for prisoners during the COVID-19 lockdown. At the same time, the lawyer claimed Gavin took full responsibility for her actions and shared character references that her former co-workers provided, despite her distasteful conduct. The judge overseeing this case said that he carefully considered any and all factors, but that it's also important to set the example that behavior like Gavin's cannot be tolerated within the prison system. He credited the young woman for taking responsibility for her actions and turning her life around, but ultimately ruled that only a custodial sentence is applicable, even though she had a baby 7-month-old son at the time. Gavin received an 8-month jail term on top of being fired from her job. Coxon was also disciplined for being caught with the cell phone and was sentenced to 10 additional months behind bars. Number 8. Tik Tok gangsters. Authorities believe that a 28-year-old Albanian gangster named Edison Kakuli illegally entered the United Kingdom at some point during 2019. Afterwards, he was convicted of participating in a brutal assault during a drug-related disagreement. In 2022, while serving time for the offense, Kakuli and his buddies got their hands on a cell phone and started posting videos of their prison antics on TikTok. In what's been described as a mockery of the UK's justice system, some of the footage showed Kakuli making a gun symbol with his hands and smoking a cigarette while dancing to rap music in his cell with his prison friends. Comments on some of their videos helped confirm that Kakuli was one of the many men shown in the footage. After catching wind of the illicit videos, the Daily Mail contacted Britain's Ministry of Justice and the clips were quickly removed. By then, the posts had gained over 13,000 views, proving how necessary it is for the UK to crack down on illegal phones making their way into the country's prisons. The incident also came right after another scandal involving a 46-year-old convicted murderer and one of Britain's most notorious prisoners, David Norris, who was caught with a cell phone only a few months earlier. Authorities made the discovery after the Daily Mail informed them that Norris had sent selfies and WhatsApp messages to his friends on the outside from within prison walls. Staff members found the phone in an intimate part of Norris's body after getting the helpful tip. He was then moved to a higher security prison with 0 chances of being relocated to a lighter security facility in the near future. Number 7. Federal prisoner seeks deadly revenge. 51-year-old Richard Gilbert was extremely unhappy with the 10-year prison sentence he received for trafficking meth. During his time behind bars, he had a lot of time to think, so he came up with the idea of hiring a hitman to kill the South Carolina-based U.S. attorney who worked on his case. Using an illegal cell phone, Gilbert made several calls to arrange the hit and even sent $2,000 from his prison account to pay for the job. Little did he know, he was actually talking to an undercover FBI agent who was posing as a hitman. According to the Department of Justice, Gilbert tried to mislead authorities by claiming the $2,000 payment was for an investment firm. Prosecutors accused him of drawing maps and providing directions to the undercover agent, on how to avoid surveillance cameras at the agreed-upon murder site. Gilbert was charged with murder for hire in 2020 and pleaded guilty in 2021 with the expectation of serving 22 years in addition to the decade-long sentence he was already doing time for. Simply put, he'll be well into his 70s by the time he's free again. Number 6. Inmate tries to kill in-laws. In late 2022, a couple in their 60s were discovered bleeding profusely from multiple stab wounds inside their Will County, Illinois home. They were immediately rushed to the hospital for treatment, along with an injured man who was later identified as their son-in-law, 36-year-old Michael Liu. Investigators figured out that Liu shot and stabbed the parents of his soon-to-be ex-wife a few days before he was going to turn himself in to Wisconsin police for a domestic battery conviction and violating an order of protection. The victim supposedly fought back fiercely and survived, leaving Liu seriously injured with 17 stab wounds himself. According to prosecutors, Liu carried out the attack on his in-laws for revenge against his estranged wife and her loved ones. He was charged with 2 counts of attempted murder, aggravated discharge of a firearm, aggravated domestic battery, home invasion, and more. While in jail, Liu allegedly tried to hire a hitman to finish what he couldn't. Authorities claimed that he approached other inmates to find a willing party and offered to pay $20,000 to have his in-laws killed. With help from a jailhouse snitch, law enforcement managed to obtain recordings of Liu agreeing to put a $10,000 down payment and an additional $10,000 upon the completion of the hit. In addition to the attempted murder charges, he now faces more charges for trying to hire a hitman. $1 million was also tacked onto his bond. He remains behind bars to this day. If convicted of the murder for hire charge, Liu could spend decades of his life in prison. Number 5. Career criminal cons fellow inmates. Like many crooks and cons before him, Michael Moller saw the American government's COVID-inspired Paycheck Protection Program as an opportunity to get easy money under what seemed like minimal oversight by police. But he was mistaken, and by the time he was arrested, he'd siphoned an estimated $4.7 million from the program. The 42-year-old was later convicted of federal fraud charges and was awaiting sentencing at a Rhode Island jail when he decided to go through with one last con. Moller convinced 2 other inmates that he was a lawyer and could help them with their cases. More specifically, he promised to assist them with their criminal and immigration cases and to get them out of jail. For a steep price, of course. He persuaded them to give his girlfriend $17,000 before they tipped off the feds and an investigation was launched. The FBI then listened in on Moller's phone calls and quickly built a case against him. One victim paid $5,000 and the other forked over $12,000. Instead of using the cash to bail the men out of jail, Moller's girlfriend decided to blow the money on gambling, weed, and Moller's commissary. Moller went so far as to tell one of his victims to pack his things because he was about to get released. Not surprisingly, that never really happened. Instead of facing another trial and even more charges, Moller agreed to let the court consider his jail fraud in deciding his sentence for the original case. Prosecutors said that he is simply incapable of stopping himself from defrauding others, further stating that during a period in time, which one would imagine Moller would be on his best behavior to convince the court he regretted his prior conduct, he did the exact opposite by orchestrating another scheme to defraud people. Moller's lawyer, on the other hand, claimed his client took full responsibility for his actions and was remorseful. The judge overseeing the case decided to sentence Moller to 7 years in prison. This wasn't his first rodeo, though. Long before the Paycheck Protection scam, Moller was sentenced to 6 months of monitored house arrest for a federal tax fraud case. During that time, he committed 4 bank robberies, which he had to serve 9 years in prison for. If that wasn't enough to stop him from committing future crimes, it's hard to believe that another 7 years in the system will. But we'll have to wait and see. Number 4. Florida woman tries to off family. While awaiting the results of her case for threatening to kill her former co-workers, 29-year-old ex-Disney employee Turegawa Inaru was locked up at Florida's Osceola County Jail. In early 2023, she was still behind bars when she apparently tried recruiting two cellmates to kill her parents and grandparents so she could collect a $2 million inheritance payout. According to authorities, Inaru offered a $50,000 payment per victim and claimed the intended victims had abused her and her siblings while they were children. Like many other murders for hire within prison walls, inmates ratted on her. In addition to accusing Inaru of trying to kill 4 of her family members, prosecutors claim she used social media to stalk the assistant state attorney prosecuting her cases. Inaru said that she would gladly kill the attorney herself if she couldn't find someone else to do it for her, and that she wanted him to suffer and didn't really care if his family died in the process. An undercover detective entered the jail posing as an inmate and got evidence that Inaru disliked the assistant state attorney and believed in conspiracy theories. They failed to get the woman to say she wanted him dead, though. During questioning, Inaru allegedly confessed to trying to hire someone to kill her family. As a result, she now faces 3 counts of solicitation of murder as well as cyber-stalking. She's currently being held without bond while her case proceeds in court. Number 3. Delaware prison standoff. In 2017, on what started out as a normal morning at the James T. Vaughn Correctional Center in Delaware, a group of inmates took 4 corrections officers and a number of other prisoners hostage. Officials later said that the hostage takers were wielding sharp objects, although they declined to elaborate on the nature of their weapons. Throughout the day, dozens of inmates left the building where the standoff was going down, and 2 of the 4 corrections officers who were held hostage were released. 3 maintenance workers who initially tried hiding in the basement eventually managed to sneak onto the building's roof, where they were rescued. As the day went on, prisons across Delaware were put under lockdown, just in case anyone got inspired. Unlike many, if not most, prison riots, this one wasn't meant to make a simple statement about the conditions or treatment at that facility. According to a message the hostage-takers delivered to the Wilmington-based News Journal, it was meant to be a bigger political statement to convey their concerns about changes that could happen within the American prison system under the Trump administration. In a series of phone calls to news outlets and negotiations with authorities, the hostage-taker inmates said that they were confident things would soon change for the worse. In exchange for the hostages' release, they demanded a program that was rehabilitative for all inmates, as well as a thorough look into the prison's budget and spending habits. In the meantime, police became increasingly worried about 47-year-old corrections officer Sergeant Stephen Floyd after hearing no word on his condition. So they made a plan to storm the building. Using a backhoe, they knocked down a wall made out of footlockers the inmates had built to block the prison's entrance. 20 hours after the standoff first started, law enforcement officers finally retook control of the prison. Sadly, Floyd was found unresponsive and was eventually declared dead at the scene. According to employees, he died while saving the lives of his co-workers. 1 female corrections officer made it out unharmed, thanks partially to some inmates who protected her from the hostage-takers. None of the 120 inmates who were still in the building suffered any injuries during the standoff, or when police later stormed the building. 16 prisoners were ultimately charged with first-degree murder, assault, kidnapping, and riot in connection to the incident. Several were acquitted of their charges. The alleged mastermind of the plot, Dwayne States, was convicted of murder and received 2 life terms on top of the life sentence he was already serving for a separate murder. His co-defendant, Jaru Ayers, was acquitted of Floyd's death but was convicted on other charges related to the incident, landing him a 123-year sentence on top of the life sentence he was serving. Royal Downs, who played a crucial role in negotiating with authorities during the standoff and eventually began cooperating, testified as the prosecution's star witness. He received a 3-year sentence for rioting, which will run consecutively to the life sentence he was already serving in connection to a separate case. Number 2. Hiring a hitman from the inside. In 2011, when an Iowa man named Jason Harriman went to federal prison for possession of a firearm as a felon, he already had 2 previous stints under his belt for kidnapping and assaulting his ex-wife. During his 3rd visit to the penitentiary, he told at least 2 fellow inmates that he wanted to find someone to help him kill his ex, who was only named in court documents as DH. One of the prisoners Harriman confided in, William Reisinger, decided to tell law enforcement about the plans, and in 2017, an investigation was officially launched. According to Reisinger, Harriman blamed DH for his imprisonment and frequently yelled at her over phone calls. After hanging up, Harriman vented to Reisinger about his frustrations and voiced his desires to disfigure the woman, making her unattractive and incapable of physical intimacy by paralyzing her. At some point, his revenge fantasy apparently escalated to murder. When Reisinger asked Harriman if he really wanted DH dead, he said yes and asked Reisinger if he knew anyone who would be willing to do the job. Reisinger said he would have to make a few calls. Little did Harriman know, the call was actually to Reisinger's son, with a request to contact law enforcement and rat out his friend on the inside. Harriman was provided with the contact information of William Johnson, an undercover agent who posed as a hitman. They spoke on several occasions on the phone and through email, which led to a 2-hour-long meeting during which they planned a written contract for the murder of DH and her boyfriend. The men initially spoke through code, referring to the victims as Property 1 and Property 2, and talking about demolishing the properties. It was pretty obvious what Harriman meant, but authorities needed more specific terminology in order to feel like they had secured enough evidence to pin him with a murder-for-hire charge. During their final meeting, Johnson got Harriman to clarify in explicit terms that he wanted both victims dead. He also gave Harriman multiple opportunities to walk away from the deal, but Harriman remained committed to seeing their agreement through to completion. He even said that he wanted DH to know he was behind what was going to happen to her. And while Harriman got suspicious over Johnson's need to confirm the details out loud and sign a written contract, he could have backed out, and he didn't. As a down payment for the double hit, he agreed to give Johnson his 1969 Dodge Charger. He also promised to pay $21,000 for DH and her boyfriend to be killed if they were together, or $41,000 if they were killed separately. In a sadistic twist, Harriman asked Johnson to record the murders on video so that once he was out of prison, he could see the crime himself. A federal jury later convicted Harriman on 2 counts of murder for hire, and he was sentenced to an additional 20 years in prison, which will run consecutively to the 15 years he is already serving. This means that he probably won't be released until sometime during the 2040s, at which point he'll be in his 70s. Number 1. Cheating wife conspires with imprisoned boyfriend. Donna Roberts met her 3rd husband, Robert Fingerhut, in 1980. A few years later, they decided to settle down in Youngstown, Ohio, where they ran a car rental business and operated 2 Greyhound bus stations. They made a comfortable living for themselves that provided Donna with pretty much anything she wanted, but she was unsatisfied with other aspects of her marriage and soon started an affair with a much younger man named Nathaniel E. Jackson. When Jackson went to prison 2 years into their affair, he and Donna stayed in touch over the phone and through written letters. During their conversations, they fantasized about being together and living like a real couple, something that could only happen if Robert Fingerhut was taken out of the picture. So it's not surprising that Fingerhut was shot to death in his home almost immediately after Jackson got out of prison in 2001. At the time, authorities were blissfully unaware of the romantic connection between Donna and Jackson. Shortly after her husband's death, Donna called 911 and played the role of a shocked and devastated widow. But it wasn't long before investigators found out about her affair with the newly released prisoner, and when they listened to phone calls between the couple while Jackson was still imprisoned, it became clear that the two had planned to kill Fingerhut. Detectives also found dozens of incriminating letters that Jackson and Roberts had written back and forth, which backed up their suspicions. While the actual murder didn't happen until Jackson was released, the evidence proved that he had agreed to commit the crime while he was still behind bars, which is illegal in and of itself. In addition to wanting Fingerhut dead so that they could carry on with their messed up relationship, authorities found reason to believe that Roberts and Jackson planned to collect the victim's life insurance policy to fund their new life. During questioning, Jackson admitted to killing Fingerhut but denied that Donna had any knowledge of the plot. He also claimed that he shot the victim out of self-defense. But DNA evidence found in Fingerhut's car tied both suspects to the scene, and the content of their messages strongly indicated that they were both involved in Fingerhut's murder. Jackson maintained all throughout his trial that Roberts had nothing to do with the crime. He was sentenced to death for the crime. Donna Roberts was also convicted and sentenced to death. She is the only woman in the state of Ohio who is currently on death row. At 78 years old, she may not live to see her execution date, but she'll eventually die in prison either way. All because she decided that killing her husband was better than leaving him. Number 12. Rudy Delgado. In early 2018, a former Hidalgo County, Texas judge named Rudy Delgado was busted for accepting thousands of dollars worth of bribes over an 8-year period starting in 2008. The arrest came following a 2-year federal probe into Delgado's suspected misconduct. Prosecutors accused the 66-year-old of conspiring with criminal defense attorney No Perez to secure favorable outcomes in criminal cases that he was overseeing, and in exchange, Delgado received generous rewards, including a $15,000 pickup truck. According to court documents, Perez routinely drove to Delgado's house under the guise of buying firewood from the judge, but in reality, the two would converse about upcoming cases involving Perez's clients. Perez would allegedly express his hope that a client would be released on their own recognizance rather than held in custody or released on bond. Then he'd pay Delgado an inflated amount of money for his firewood. The client, at the center of the discussion, would then be released from custody at their next hearing. Perez reportedly fell under FBI suspicion for unrelated acts of suspected corruption, and throughout the course of their investigation, the feds discovered the arrangement between Perez and Delgado. They shifted their focus toward Delgado, though, after Perez agreed to cooperate with the authorities and wear a wire during his conversations with his accomplice, during which he offered bribes to the judge. The FBI further accused Delgado of finding out about the investigation and attempting to interfere with it. A jury convicted Delgado on 8 felony counts, including conspiracy to commit bribery, federal program bribery, use of a facility in interstate commerce in aid of a racketeering enterprise, and obstruction of justice, and as a result, he was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. According to records, however, Delgado was released in November of 2022. Number 11. Tracy Hunter. While serving as a state judge in Hamilton County, Ohio's juvenile court system, Tracy Hunter was accused of seeking information about a case against her brother, Stephen, a youth corrections officer who was accused of hitting an inmate at the facility where he worked. Tracy allegedly passed her findings, including documents about the accuser, onto Stephen in an effort to help him keep his job, but in the end he was fired, and Tracy's position also fell under scrutiny. In 2014, the former judge was convicted of having an unlawful interest in a public contract. The case languished in the court system for years as Tracy appealed her conviction. She insisted all along that she didn't break any laws, but the ruling was upheld, and in 2020, she was sentenced to 6 months in prison. When the sentence was handed down, Tracy went limp and had to be carried out of the courtroom. It would only be fair to point out that Tracy had a lot of supporters throughout her court dealings. Many believed that racism played a factor in the decisions and rulings against her, while others accused Tracy of playing victim. And the saga isn't over. As of 2023, Tracy is petitioning the Supreme Court to get her law license reinstated. She still has a lot of supporters who feel that she received an unfair shake from the very system that she was once tasked with upholding. Number 10. Mark Cavella Jr. and Michael Conahan. In a shocking case of corruption dubbed by the media as Kids for Cash, a Pennsylvania judge accepted at least $1 million in bribes from developers of juvenile detention centers. In exchange for the kickbacks, former Luzerne County Judge Mark Cavella Jr. sentenced defendants to extended time in these privately owned, for-profit facilities. And many of the victims received disproportionately long sentences for minimal offenses, such as mocking their school principal on social media, trespassing in a vacant building, or stealing movies from Walmart. As a result of the scandal, thousands of criminal cases were tossed. And in a satisfying twist of irony, a major criminal case was brought against Cavella, who pleaded guilty in 2009 to federal charges of honest services fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion. More specifically, he admitted to conspiracy to deprive the public of the intangible right of honest services. In other words, corruption, and conspiracy to defraud the United States by failing to report income to the IRS. Despite these admissions, Cavella denied that his kickbacks were connected to any of the sentences he imposed during his time as a juvenile court judge. His plea agreement called for a sentence of 7 years, but because of his denial, the judge overseeing the case rejected the deal. Then, a few months later, the court brought the hammer down even harder on Cavella, as well as his alleged co-conspirator, former Judge Michael Conahan. The pair were indicted on 48 federal counts, including racketeering, fraud, money laundering, extortion, bribery, and federal tax violations. In 2011, Cavella was found guilty of racketeering, and as a result, he was sentenced to 28 years in prison. Michael Conahan initially pleaded guilty, but withdrew his plea with plans to take his case to trial. He eventually changed his mind again, though, and pleaded guilty, consequently receiving a sentence of 17.5 years behind bars. In 2022, Cavella and Conahan were ordered to pay $200 million to nearly 300 victims of the Kids for Cash scandal. And while the ruling brought long-awaited closure to many, no amount of money can heal the victims of the mental and emotional impacts of the injustices they suffered at the hands of the former judges. Number 9. Jeffrey Ferguson. It's only fair to say right off the bat that the next judge on today's list hasn't been sent to prison. Not yet, at least. And depending on how his case goes, he may never go to prison. For now, he's entitled to the same presumption of innocence that's afforded to every other criminally accused defendant in America. But this case is too shocking not to include in today's video. In August of 2023, authorities announced the arrest of 72-year-old Jeffrey Ferguson, who up until that point was serving as a Superior Court judge in Orange County, California. Unlike many of the judges on today's list, Ferguson isn't accused of your typical run-of-the-mill corruption or financial crimes. He faces a much more serious charge of murder in connection with the death of his wife, 65-year-old Cheryl Ferguson, who was found dead from a gunshot wound at the couple's home in Anaheim. According to court documents, the shooting occurred during an argument that began earlier that evening while the Fergusons were out to dinner. Jeffrey Ferguson allegedly mimicked shooting Cheryl while they were still in the restaurant. And when the couple arrived home, Cheryl challenged her husband to point a real gun at her, at which point Jeffrey allegedly removed his pistol from an ankle holster and shot his wife in the chest. Police reportedly received a lot of their information from the Fergusons' adult son, who spent the evening with his parents, and dialed 911 after the back-and-forth bickering took its deadly turn. During the 911 call, the son told the dispatcher that his father had been drinking too much and shot his mother. The judge also called 911 and reported the incident, but is accused of skirting around the topic when the dispatcher asked him if he shot his wife. Additionally, Ferguson allegedly texted the court clerk and bailiff with an apology for his actions, stating that he just lost it and admitting to shooting Cheryl. He then informed his colleagues that he wouldn't be in court the next day because he'd be in custody. According to police reports, Judge Ferguson smelled like booze and told responding officers that he couldn't believe what he'd just done. And what was more surprising was that over 47 legally owned weapons and over 26,000 rounds of ammunition were removed from the home. In addition to murder, Ferguson faces 2 gun-related counts, including the personal discharge of a firearm causing great bodily injury or death. He's free on $1 million bail, pending the outcome of the case. According to recent updates, prosecutors are attempting to get the judge's passport revoked and to have him put on an ankle monitor to prevent him from fleeing. They're also trying to restrict Ferguson's contact with his son due to his status as a witness. In a statement, Ferguson's attorneys described the tragedy as an accident and nothing more, but the outcome of the case remains to be seen. This likely goes without saying, but if convicted, Ferguson will be removed from his position as a judge. Number 8. Jac Tarpley Camp Jr. When a public official runs into legal trouble toward the end of their career, they sometimes opt to bow out of their position as gracefully as possible by retiring instead of waiting to be fired. Such was the case for former U.S. federal judge Jac Tarpley Camp Jr., who tendered his resignation from the bench in November 2010 after pleading guilty to multiple drug-related crimes. Less than 2 months earlier, Camp was arrested by the FBI in the state of Georgia for allegedly buying various illegal drugs and sharing them with an exotic dancer. According to federal authorities, the 67-year-old had purchased cocaine, marijuana, hydrocodone, and roxicodone and shared them with a stripper who he'd been having an extramarital affair with for several months. Camp was then hit with 4 drug-related charges and 1 count of possessing a firearm while illegally using drugs. The case against the disgraced judge came after his mistress, who had a previous drug conviction, cooperated with investigators in exchange for having no charges brought against her. Then, shortly after his arrest, Camp stepped down from the bench in what was later described as a leave of absence with pay. He ultimately pleaded guilty to 1 felony count of aiding and abetting a felon's possession of a controlled substance, as well as 2 misdemeanor counts for possession of illegal drugs and giving the stripper a government-issued laptop. And as part of his plea agreement, Camp retired from the bench permanently. He was also sentenced to 30 days in prison and was ordered to complete community service. And in addition, he was hit with a hefty fine. Number 7. Lance Mason. Throughout his career as both a lawyer and a public official, Lance Mason wore many hats. After serving in the Ohio Senate and House of Representatives and acting as an assistant prosecutor, he became a judge in Cuyahoga County in 2008. Mason's life began to spiral downward in early 2014 when he and his wife at the time, Aisha Fraser, separated. The split seemed to be going peacefully enough for the first few months, as the former couple shared custody of their children and even the use of a vehicle. They also frequently saw each other at church and elsewhere. 5 months after separating, however, Mason and Fraser got into a heated argument during the drive home from a relative's funeral. According to court documents, Mason repeatedly struck his estranged wife in the face, bit her, and even smashed her head against the car's passenger window, armrest, and dashboard. He was also accused of grabbing Fraser by the hair when she attempted to flee from the vehicle, striking her several times after she escaped from the car and fell to the ground, and leaving her at the scene. Court documents further state that Fraser was hospitalized for severe facial, head, and neck injuries, including a fracture below her eye that required a surgical implant. During a search of Mason's home, authorities seized a large cache of weapons, including shotguns, semi-automatic rifles, handguns, smoke grenades, a sword, and over 2,500 rounds of ammunition. Mason was initially charged with 8 felonies, but struck a deal with prosecutors and pleaded guilty to felonious assault and domestic violence in 2015. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and 6 months in county lockup, but was freed after serving just 9 months when the court granted his motion for early release. When considering the decision, the court reviewed an apologetic letter Mason wrote to Fraser from prison, as well as a letter of support written by his former colleague, U.S. Representative Marcia Fudge. In addition to getting out of prison early, Mason scored a city job with a starting salary of $45,000 per year. Not a bad deal for someone who was convicted of a serious violent felony. He was ordered to have no contact with Fraser. Their divorce had been finalized when Mason was in prison, and aside from anything related to their children, he had no reason to interact with his ex-wife. A rational person in Mason's shoes would have done their best to move on with their life and keep their nose out of trouble, but he was apparently unable to let go of his misgivings over his failed marriage. Then, in November 2018, he stabbed Fraser to death in the driveway of his home, while exchanging custody of their children. Less than a year later, the 51-year-old pleaded guilty to a laundry list of charges, including aggravated murder, felonious assault, violating an order of protection, and grand theft. Mason said that he wanted to take responsibility for his actions and that he wanted to avoid delaying or prolonging the resolution of the case any more than he already had. And in the end, he was sentenced to life in prison with the eligibility for parole after 35 years served. Number 6. Saul Vler. While serving as the chief judge of the New York Court of Appeals in 1988, Saul Vler began an affair with a woman named Joy Silverman. At the time, he was the co-executor of Silverman's stepfather's estate and a trustee who was tasked with overseeing $24 million worth of trusts that were connected to the estate. After Silverman ended the affair in September of 1991, she accused Vler of harassing her. Then in 1992, Vler was charged with multiple federal crimes, including extortion, racketeering, and blackmail. According to prosecutors, he demanded a $20,000 blackmail payment in exchange for turning over compromising photographs and tapes of Silverman. In other words, it was essentially a revenge porn threat before the concept as we know it today existed. Vler was also accused of threatening to kidnap Silverman's daughter, which he eventually pleaded guilty to, along with admitting to harassment. The conviction marked the end of his judicial career, and he was sentenced to 15 months in federal prison. However, he was released after serving only 13 months and went on to become an accomplished writer, mental health advocate, and law professor. And in addition to writing a memoir, Vler became a critic at large for New York Magazine. His law license was restored in 2007, and he's currently an adjunct professor at Touro Law Center in Long Island, New York. There's no excuse for Vler's crimes, but his case admittedly shows that some convicted criminals can redeem themselves for their past mistakes and pursue meaningful futures. Number 5. Thomas J. Spargo. In 2006, a state-level commission recommended the removal of New York Supreme Court Judge Thomas J. Spargo from the bench amid allegations stemming back to his campaign for Burntown justice in 1999. Suspicion initially fell on Spargo when he won the race for judge as a Republican candidate in a heavily Democratic town. According to the commission's findings, he induced voters to vote for him by offering items of value, including coupons for donuts, coffee, gasoline, free cider, donuts, and pizza. It was also determined that Spargo participated in a loud and obstructive demonstration while attending a vote recounting session in Florida following the 2000 presidential election. In a nutshell, the judge was accused of behaving inappropriately while advocating for George W. Bush amid a dispute over the election results. Spargo also allegedly solicited donations from lawyers in an effort to pay his legal expenses in connection with judicial misconduct accusations that he was being investigated for at the time. The commission found that Spargo had filed numerous lawsuits in federal and state court in an attempt to stop the ongoing investigation, racking up a $140,000 legal bill in the process. And when he couldn't, or perhaps wouldn't, foot the bill himself, he turned to lawyers who had cases with him before and asked for their financial aid. In a statement, the commission's leader, Robert H. Tembeckjan, pointed out the irony of how the misconduct resulting from Spargo's attempts to interfere with the investigation was far more serious than the original complaints. The commission didn't take their decision to recommend Spargo's removal lightly. And in the less than 30 years that the group had been investigating misconduct cases, this was the 6th time they'd taken action to remove a Supreme Court judge, and it was the harshest penalty that the commission could impose. Spargo didn't challenge the decision. He stepped down from the bench and was permanently banned from holding judicial office in New York State. But his troubles were far from over. In December 2008, the disgraced former judge was indicted on federal corruption charges. A jury found him guilty of attempted extortion and attempted solicitation of a bribe for pressuring a lawyer to donate $10,000 to his personal legal fund. Spargo was consequently disbarred and sentenced to 27 months in prison. Even after his conviction, though, local residents spoke highly of him. Some civilians limited their kindness to saying that they still regarded the former judge as a neighbor and would still help him if he was in need, while others described him as nice, a good person, and even brilliant. But Spargo wasn't above the law, and as the saying goes, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. Number 4. Alan Lowry. Former West Virginia Supreme Court Justice Alan Lowry fell under scrutiny in 2017 when an expose by local station WCHS-TV revealed a pattern of reckless spending by the state's top judges. More specifically, the report focused on the seemingly exorbitant costs of renovating Lowry's office. Lowry denied the allegations in an interview with reporter Kenny Bass, but by then the financial discrepancies had caught the attention of the FBI, so an investigation was already underway. In June of 2018, the 47-year-old was indicted on a slew of federal charges, including fraud, making false statements, and witness tampering. According to investigators, Lowry had engaged in a scheme to defraud the West Virginia government by claiming false mileage for gas reimbursement. He also used government vehicles and credit cards for personal travel and expenses, and he commandeered a valuable and historic Supreme Court desk for his own personal use at his home. It may not seem like a big deal that Lowry removed a piece of furniture from his workplace and took it home, but the item in question wasn't a junky old second-hand desk that needed a new home. Known as a Cass Gilbert desk, it was one of just 5 pieces of its kind that had been selected for use in the state's Supreme Court chambers back in the 1920s. It was nearly a century old when Lowry took it, and it's a highly valued relic of West Virginia's history. It was also one of 3 Cass Gilbert desks that vanished from the building in recent years. After being questioned about their whereabouts, Lowry returned the desk he'd taken home, and the other 2 missing desks reappeared shortly thereafter. In addition to his alleged financial crimes, Lowry was accused of lying to the FBI several months earlier while being questioned about his illegal activities. He was also accused of trying to mislead investigators by accusing others of malfeasance and engaging in other fraudulent conduct. Then, 5 months after his arrest, he resigned from the bench. A jury convicted Lowry of 7 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of mail fraud, 1 count of witness tampering, and 2 counts of lying to the FBI. The former judge was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, but he was released in December of 2020 after serving nearly his entire term. Even after serving his time, Lowry tried to clear his name. He appealed his conviction repeatedly until it reached the Supreme Court, which refused to hear the case. Number 3. Doug Patterson. During his time as a state judge in Limestone County, Alabama, Doug Patterson wrote at least 70 checks to himself from the county's Juvenile Services Fund. In other words, he illegally paid himself using money that was meant for the local youth. The judge also allegedly stole money from some of his elderly and disabled clients while acting as their financial conservator. According to court documents, Patterson's crimes began in 2013 when he was tasked with overseeing the finances of a mentally incapacitated veteran who was living in a nursing home. Over a 2-year period, he stole nearly $50,000 from the victim's accounts by writing checks to himself in amounts ranging from hundreds to thousands of dollars at a time. And in the meantime, he failed to provide accurate documentation of his client's finances. When the client passed away in 2014, Patterson informed the man's daughter that there was $40,000 left in the account, when in reality, the amount was closer to $200. The client's daughter made dozens of attempts to retrieve the money before finally receiving $25,000 from Patterson. According to investigators, he secured a private loan in order to come up with the money, and he never paid the woman the remaining balance that she was owed. And this all happened before Patterson was appointed as a judge in 2016. He went on to commit the rest of his crimes shortly after being sworn in. Finally, in 2019, Patterson was indicted on multiple state-level felonies, including using his position for personal gain, financial exploitation of the elderly, and theft of property. A year later, he pleaded guilty to all 3 crimes, which could have come with a prison sentence of up to 45 years. However, Patterson only received a 4-year sentence in state prison, followed by 6 years of probation. He never offered an explanation for why he committed his crimes, but all things considered, it's likely safe to assume that greed was the main factor. Number 2. Jac Delisle. Jac Delisle enjoyed a successful career as a judge in the Canadian province of Quebec from 1985 until his retirement in 2009 at the age of 74. And in 2010, he became the first judge in Canadian history to be charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors accused Delisle of killing his wife, 71-year-old Marie Nicole Rainville, after police initially suspected that she'd taken her own life. According to people who knew the couple, Rainville was left partially paralyzed by a stroke that she suffered in the months leading up to her death. Speaking anonymously with CBC News, one neighbor said that Rainville could no longer walk and was barely able to talk after the stroke. The resident said that Delisle occasionally pushed his wife outside in her wheelchair and that the former judge also appeared to be in poor health. According to the neighbor, Delisle lost weight and rarely said a word to his neighbors beyond greeting them in passing. Delisle denied having any involvement in Rainville's death, and the allegations against him were controversial from the very beginning. At least one prosecutor withdrew from the case, even after authorities specifically sought out a prosecuting attorney who didn't personally know Delisle. When the case finally went to trial in 2012, prosecutors accused Delisle of having an affair with his secretary. The Crown argued that the retired judge murdered Rainville to avoid a costly divorce and so he could move in with his mistress. Delisle was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years. He unsuccessfully tried to appeal the conviction in 2013 and spent nearly a decade in prison while he fought to clear his name. Finally, though, in April 2021, he was granted a new trial after successfully challenging the reliability of some of the evidence that was used against him. Delisle was freed from prison, and in April 2022, a Superior Court judge announced that they wouldn't be seeking a new trial. Prosecutors appealed the decision a few weeks later, and there have been no updates on the case since then. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear even more stories, stay tuned for some extra content that you might have missed. Number 1. John Waltman. Over a 5-year period starting in 2011, former Bucks County, Pennsylvania Judge John Waltman conspired with other public officials to extort bribes and kickbacks from local businessmen. For example, in November 2016, the suspects accepted a $1,000 bribe and the promise of further payments in exchange for a fixed outcome to a traffic violation case in Waltman's courtroom. Waltman and his co-defendants, Bernard Rafferty and Robert Hoops, also allegedly promised contracts to Bucks County businessmen in exchange for kickbacks. The trio were also accused of laundering money for people they believed were involved in drug trafficking, bank fraud, and committing healthcare fraud. According to federal authorities, Waltman, Rafferty, and Hoops laundered $400,000 in cash and took an $80,000 cut for themselves. And according to Philly Burbs journalist Phil Gianfacaro, the FBI obtained recordings of Waltman bragging about his ability to persuade local council members to vote in favor of his wishes. In 2019, Waltman pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering and violating an anti-extortion law known as the Hobbs Act. Prosecutors recommended a 9 to 11-year sentence, but the 61-year-old was sentenced to just 6.5 years in prison, well below the sentencing guidelines for the crime. In some people's opinions, it was a far cry from justice, especially considering the level at which Waltman betrayed public trust. But the feds hailed the outcome as a success and as a reflection of their commitment to bringing justice to the perpetrators of financial crimes. If you knew that you were likely to be found guilty of a crime and sent to prison for a year or two, but a judge offered to let you off the hook in exchange for a bribe, would you consider paying it, or at least try to come up with the money? Or would you report the crooked judge to the authorities and hope that they believe you, and that maybe they would reward your honesty by reducing or dropping your charges? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.